Go.
All right, we finally got finished with the days of creation. Now we're actually going to be going into the periods of the Bible. And we're going to be starting off with the time from just after creation through the flood. And that means starting off with Eden. There's very little that we know about Eden for sure. Even in the Bible, we only have just less than a handful of chapters on that. But we do know a few things. As far as the exact extent, we don't, but we do have a range. Anywhere from day 8 to about 118 years, Adam and Eve could have been in Eden. And this is based upon a few assumptions as far as the age of Cain and Abel, what they had been to do their functions as far as herdsman and farmer, and the date of Seth's birth. So some potential in there, but we don't know for sure. As far as the time of Eden, what the lands look like, we don't know the exact shape, but it may have looked something like this. And it makes sense with what the Bible tells us. Since the Bible tells us that all the waters were gathered into one place, it makes sense that all the land was gathered into one place as well. But the orientation is a bit of an uncertainty. It may have looked like this, or it may have been rotated about 110 degrees, and this is because there either must have been true polar wonder, meaning the pole moved, or just apparent polar wonder. And this is because we can see the magnetic fields in the lowest sediments, and then we assume that the continent's relation to the poles, but then we have to assume the poles were either the same or different. And this continent can be referred to as Pannotia, Rodinia. There's probably a few other names out there depending on what model. Most of these names do come from evolutionary models. There's not really a big model from the biblical perspective on this, so we are borrowing a lot of the naming from that convention. That being said, a lot of this is just something that they can't even agree on, so there's a lot of open here in both models. Now you can see the two potential orientations. The top there is the most likely, since from a flood model perspective, they have done a number of models on this, starting with a similar orientation, and then based upon what they expect to have occurred, they can get them to basically the modern orientation of the continents. The bottom view, a little bit more difficult, and so most likely there was true polar wonder. So that means the polar orientation would have been switched, moved around. But again, there is some uncertainty with this. Now, Eden, we know, was somewhere in the east. We don't know where. We don't know if it was in the north, south, but somewhere on the east side. But we also seem to have Adam and Eve going to the east, since the east of the garden is guarded. So in short, we don't know. Maybe a mountain based upon Ezekiel. We're not going to find that out. Probably not in my lifetime anyway. As far as what it would have been like in Eden, we know that there was shalom, no biological evil or suffering. The current processes that we see that are running down basically would not be running down. They would have continued indefinitely. There have been health with no disease. Developmental aging, meaning going from a child to an adult, but no degenerative aging, no wrinkly skin, nothing than that. And there would have likely been pain. During the curse, during the fall, God knows that the pain of birth would sharply increase. Not that it would be given, meaning that there probably was some pain. And this also serves a very important physiologic purpose. It does something for our bodies. That being said, it probably wouldn't be anywhere near severe as what we experience today, and there would be no disease processes where pain is just constant. Then there would likely have been decay of non-living materials. So trees, us, all life produces some sort of waste. Likely that this would have occurred even at that time. Skin cells falling off, trees having their leaves fall off, a number of things like that. So there would have been some sort of decay, but not of living material, not of living animals, people. And in short, this is going to be our foundation for an ethical normative, meaning what things should be like, the standard, what God wanted for man. And if we have this mindset, we can then see things today and it gives us a better understanding of what is a pathology, what is a disease, what is wrong. Because if we're coming at this from an evolutionary worldview, as far as studying science today, we're going to be seeing or looking for different things than if we come at such things from a biblical, a creationist mindset, because we're going to be looking for different things. Now, as far as death and the fall, there are a number of questions about this out in the world. But first, before we figure out what death was, let's actually ask what life was. Biblically, we see a number of passages defining life. Life is in the blood, Leviticus, and the breath of life, Genesis 2:17. So by these definitions, what we consider life today and what the Bible can give a definition for life are vastly different. So while we think of plants, fungi, bacteria, and even jellyfish as alive, the biblical model necessarily wouldn't necessarily believe that they are alive. Now there is some uncertainty on insects because they do have blood of a sort and they do breathe of a sort, but not the same way we breathe. And so there is some uncertainty as far as if they would have been considered to be on the ark, for example. But we'll get into that when we start actually talking about the flood. And we know that all animals and all humans ate plants at this time. There was no carnivory in Eden. There was mutualism, no parasitism. So there had been lichen where moss and algae are merged together, but no parasites, no organisms feeding completely off of another to their detriment. Now, as far as death, we know that death entered the world because of sin. Literally, in Genesis 2:16 and 17, when you eat it, you will surely die. The Hebrew is dying, you shall die, or you shall die. There are a number of ways to approach this. Some suggest that this is two deaths, spiritual death and a physical death. Some say that this is mainly physical, die, you shall die, so you begin to decay, you'll begin to age as far as get old, and then you shall die. And interesting enough, when Eve is talking to the serpent, she changes what God says to just die. So there is some interesting things there, some nuance. And then in Genesis 3, we see that the days of Adam's life, and Eve's as well, is numbered. We also see this for the snake. So this seems to indicate that Adam and the snake now have numbered lives, which means the snake before would have had an innumerable life, an immortal life, the same as Adam. So both animals and man likely were basically immortal, having access to the tree of life there. And we see this supported in the New Testament as well. Romans 5, death through sin, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the offense of Adam. So we see that sin and death are definitely related here, definitely connected. But this brings the question, what about accidental death? Could somebody have fallen out of a tree? Could somebody have got too close to a fire and fell in the fire? Could somebody have swam too deep and drowned? Now that is some criticisms from a number of people that say there had to have been death before the fall, while in Eden. Yet we see in Hebrews 1:3 that God upholds the universe. And he upheld the Israelites' clothing in the wilderness, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire. So it is very easy to conceive of how God could have changed how he upheld the universe, so where he would not have allowed for such accidental deaths. It is perfectly consistent with our understanding of God and definitely with his abilities. Another criticism is that the phrase subdue and rule in Genesis 1:28 implies death and violence. But to subdue and rule does not imply that. In fact, later on in the Mosaic Law, we're told that the kings are not to subdue and rule violently over Israel. So there is a difference. And we do this today. If you are an employee, you are subdued and ruled over by your boss, though I hope there's no violence in that. Same way for children. Parents subdue and rule over their children. If you have pets, you subdue and rule over your pets, but you are not killing your pet. And so this does not imply violence, death, or anything of that note. And another difference because of this no death would have been the offspring production would have been greatly reduced. While it definitely would have been offspring produced by both animals and man, because of the command be fruitful and multiply, the offspring production rate would have likely been very, very low. We don't know how low though. So dogs today, they can have anywhere from 8 to 12 pups on average in a litter, and they can have potentially 2 litters a year, meaning that within about 12 years there could be over 100 million dogs. And they're estimating about 900 million dogs today. So within a few generations, we would have had today's population numbers. It is likely, though, that the population production would have been reduced. So would have Adam and Eve had a child every decade, every century, or every millennium? We don't know. But it's likely that it would have been reduced. Another question is rain during Eden. Now, again, the idea that there not was rain during Eden, that there was no rain at this time up to the flood, comes from the canopy model, which isn't held to by most creations today because the science doesn't really match, as well as it doesn't match a few of the Psalms that we mentioned earlier in the classes. But as far as the context of Genesis 2, 4 through 6, where it talks about a mist where rain is not coming down, the timing is actually before plants and man. Later on, after this, you see that God created man, and then it fast forwards us a few days. But there is no mention of rain or springs or mist from Eden to the flood, from this verse past the flood, or to the flood, I should say. But based upon our understanding of the water cycle, it is very likely that there was rain at this time. It is very hard to conceive of a mechanism how there would be no rain from Eden through the curse and through the pre-flood period with all this water that we have. That being said, it's hard to conceive of there being rain with no sunlight producing a rainbow. So there must have been a difference. Now, it could be either way, but overall it's a little bit easier to conceive of a mechanism how there would be rain but no rainbow, since all you need is a little less sun, versus all this water but no rain. But this is a question that is up in the air. Any questions coming in? Any questions here about life in Eden before we move on to the fall? No text coming in? All right.
Shalom means peace.
Mm-hmm.
And then is that different from shalom, which you had up on the board? That's the same word?
I believe so, yeah. That's what I meant. That was what I was going for. I may have not have spelled it correctly. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but
Neither am I.
Are you indicating that there were many people in Eden?
no.
Okay.
No, I'm saying that if Adam and Eve had not sinned, then there could have been more people.
I understand.
The question is how long until their generations would have been produced? We just don't know.
Okay, gotcha.
But no, just one man, one woman.
Just check it.
Yep.
Just
Appreciate it.
trying to figure out what, yeah. Some of the things that you're saying are not the way I talk about things, so, you know, but it's interesting conjecture.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the thing about the rainbow and all the other things that don't seem to make sense from our current models of science, God can do anything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. We don't know a lot about this. A lot of this is just conjecture.
right.
Hopefully one day we'll know more. Maybe not in this life, but
Right.
we'll find out, hopefully.
Additionally, the rainbow could have been an existing phenomenon, and God is declaring that now it has a meaning.
That's
Mhm.
true.
So he could be saying, I'm saying now this has this meaning, you will remember it.
Okay.
Just like bread and lamb had meaning, or existed before Passover, and then it had specific meaning.
Good point.
There are questions coming in now. So one asks about the lower reproduction rate you were mentioning. Why would that be?
Because if everything produced at its current rate, humans wouldn't be a big problem, but animals, take bees for example. Bees produce thousands and thousands and thousands of offspring every year. Very quickly, we would have incredibly high numbers of bees. Now, it may be that after a while, God would stop their reproduction. We don't know, but it makes more sense that they would have been a slower reproduction, an easier mechanism, and that's why we're leaning towards that. That's the only reason.
Another question comes in, sort of multi-parter, asking why do we need to prove creation scientifically in general? Can we not just consider a miracle that science can't explain, such as Jesus raising the dead? Scientific impossibility, we accept it as a miracle,
Mm-hmm.
we don't try to apply science to it.
And yet, miraculous events we cannot understand purely from scientific approaches. But miraculous wine is still digested. Miraculous bread, like the manna, is still eaten and produces waste. Miraculous events, miraculous birth, still produces a person. And so we should still be able to see the downstream effects of these miracles, and it should be consistent with what we're seeing today. That's the main reason why we're approaching this. And because in our society there is such a dramatic push to the contrary, that to believe in that would change our very understanding of God and put a lot of questions as far as the legitimacy of the rest of the Bible. I hope that answers your question.
I think there's something to be said for that regarding like fossils, for instance.
Mhm.
This is one I recall. There are some people who are convinced scientifically that fossils can only form over eons of time. They take millions of years to form, and yet they believe in creation in the Bible, and therefore their conclusion is that fossils are a lie planted by Satan. That there are some fundamentalists, probably, I don't know if that's a common belief anymore, but some believe that fossils had to be a deception planted by Satan. And so part of it is people that are both scientists and Christians who trust what the Bible says want to show how the science of what fossils are is true and it's compatible with what we see in the Bible. It's trying to explain that.
Thank you, Micah. Yeah. I hope everyone was able to hear him. I'm not going to be able to repeat that in such an elegant manner.
I have a comment to that
Sure.
too. It's my faith tells me that God created a mature earth, which means there was oil under the ground. God can create a fossil just as easy as he can create anything else.
He could create all that. The problem with the fossils is there's a lot of evidence of death and decay and disease, and it's hard to understand why God would create such a thing as showing death and disease and all that negative in a place such as Eden. Plus, a lot of the things that we see in the Bible make a much more better explanation of it naturally. So the natural explanation of like the flood, for example, would fit with a lot of these findings more so than a miraculous creation. But it still is a possibility. Any other comments coming? Any other questions?
Not yet, though there is a delay, so
Okay.
chime in if they respond.
Perfect. So we'll move on to the fall. Now, there are some noted physiological effects. We're going to be focusing on the physical effects, not necessarily the spiritual effects or stuff like that from the fall. Now, we know that all the animals, all the beasts of the field, were cursed, because the serpent is cursed more than all, implying that the others were indeed cursed. The serpent is now crawling on its belly. We don't know how it moved around beforehand. It may have walked, it may have flew, it may have hopped on its tail like a pogo stick for all we know. Mankind, though, we have a few noted effects there. Birth pain increasing greatly for Eve and the subsequent women. The ground was cursed. Now man will have to work for his food. The body will now die. They were then kicked out of the garden, and clothing was needed. We see later on in Genesis 6 and Romans 8 that all living creatures had corrupted their ways, and not only the living creatures, but all creation suffered decay. Some may ask, why were the animals cursed because of man, because of Adam? And they would say that they weren't cursed because that would be unjust. Therefore, it didn't happen. Therefore, nothing in Eden really occurred, none of the fall occurred. But as far as using this to try and negate that, in World War II, a number of animals, especially horses, were still in use, and many of them died. We shouldn't try to deny World War II because we can't believe all these horses died as a result. And we need to remember that Adam was given dominion over the world. So when Adam sinned, everything under his dominion fell also. We see this in the Old Testament when the king of Israel or Judah or whatnot, when they have sinned, when they have brought about punishment from God, it is not just them receiving the punishment, but their entire domain. Even David, when he sinned, caused Israel to suffer. It is the same here. And so we know that God changed how he sustained the world. Everything is now waxing old, it's wearing out. But it's not wearing out at the same time. Just like certain clothes that you have, some will wear out very quickly, others take a little bit longer. Same thing we're seeing now. Even the age of man. Before the flood, we lived much longer. After the flood, we started to get to more modern lifespans. The sun will eventually burn out, but it's not burning out as fast as the human life, for example. So things are decaying, but they're decaying at their own rate. They're falling apart at their own rate. And so everything is just slightly imperfect. But we can still see the beauty and the design of God in nature and the world around us. But we have to be able to filter out and understand the bad, the evil, the cursed aspects, the decaying aspects, the degenerative aging and the disease aspects. Now some will say that God introduced nephesh death, the death of life, because he's trying to minimize suffering. And death is truly evil in a world without curse, in a world without suffering. And in a cursed world, death truly is a mercy to some extent. But trying to give a motive to God's reasoning is questionable, because death may simply be a punishment, or it may be a combination of both. We don't know. We just need to be careful about giving motives to God's judgments. And at this time, we likely see the reproduction capacity ramping up. If nothing else, just to replace the death, let alone the predation, the killing, the competition. And we are likely seeing a production of defense mechanisms and potentially even attack mechanisms in this. Though we'll get more into this here in a bit. And these likely did not occur suddenly right after the fall, but most likely occurred over years, potentially even centuries. Now, when we're looking at nature, we as Bible believers are looking for evidence of God's design. And many will look at these features of defense mechanisms, of attack mechanisms, as part of God's original design. And unfortunately, that gives an incorrect opinion of God. As Buchanan here, Mr. Buchanan writes, when creationists talk about God creating every individual species as a separate act, they always instance hummingbirds or orchids, sunflowers, and beautiful things. But I tend to think instead of a parasitic worm that is boring through the eye of a boy sitting on the bank of a river in West Africa, a worm that's going to make him blind. And I ask them, are you telling me that the God you believe in, who you always say is an all-merciful God who cares for each one of us individually, are you saying that God created this worm that can live in no other way than in an innocent child's eyeball? Because that does not seem to me to coincide with a God who's full of mercy. And this is a legitimate question. The question of evil in this world is a very legitimate question. And we as Christians need to be able to have an answer for this, for ourselves and for others. Now, the overall question of evil in this world is beyond our subject for the day. We'll be focusing on the biological evil in this world. But I encourage you, if you do not have a ready answer for this, to research, to pursue this for your own, because this is a very important question that you need to be able to have an answer for. As far as the evil that we see in this world, some of it was brought about by the fall itself. We know for sure that the thorns were a result of the fall. They were not part of God's original design, but were later brought out of his design. Perhaps put in there before the fall, but brought out afterwards. The serpent crawling on its belly is another physical change that we are seeing. So we know that after the fall, some things did physically change as a result of that. We have examples here too. Perhaps there was more. Potentially sharp teeth, claws, even the special glands that produce spider webs are some of these potentials. And we know that if there is a physical change from our study today, there must have been a genetic change as well. Not necessarily a creation of new genes, but a change in genetic expression. In our previous lessons, we talked about some different ways that genes are expressed. They're regulated by a number of different mechanisms, from RNA to proteins to different genes to the epigenetics. And so all these may have been altered by the change in the environment, by the change in the way God upheld the earth, the world, in order to produce some of these changes. This is definitely a very important thing that we as creation scientists can pursue in the future. But as far as some of these features, a good portion of them were likely not being used for their original purpose. Sharp teeth are some of the most notable attack features that we see in animals today, yet we see a number of animals, such as the giant panda, fruit bats, that have the same teeth that more predatory animals have, yet they exist mainly on a diet, or completely on a diet of vegetation. So these teeth are inherently attack structures, attack features. They are simply being used in an incorrect way. A pitchfork is a great farming implement, but you can definitely use that to harm or kill somebody. Claws is another example. They are primarily used to grip and for traction. Even in predatory animals, they primarily use them to grab a hold of their prey. Lionesses, when they hunt, they are not slashing at their prey. They are jumping, grabbing, and then using the only other tool they have, their jaws, to then kill their prey. So they are using them for grip and traction, but they are using them in an incorrect manner, in an incorrect design, or as they were not previously designed. Squirrels are a prime example of this. They have some massive claws. They use this to get everywhere, including in your vehicles and destroying them, such as I've experienced. Chameleons, they have tongues that they use to grab flying insects. This has also been shown to grab vegetation. Spider webs, these are very intricately designed organs for them. And they have used these to catch pollen and actually eat the pollen. And many viruses and bacteria that we have seen them used beneficially or to the detriment of different organisms, different species. and it just depends on how they're being utilized, where they're at, and the state of the person or animal that they are existing in. And this brings us to parasites. Over the entire world, for almost every creature, there are parasites. There's parasites on the outside, ectoparasites, and parasites on the inside. Many are deadly and dangerous. You can see there the parasite in that fish that replaces the fish's tongue. These are all likely due to the fall. Now, we think there would have been a previous beneficial, or at the very least neutral effect, because we see some parasites that do have a neutral or beneficial effect today. Tapeworms are a very common example of this. Tapeworms have basically no known negative effects with people. And no, they will not help you lose weight. A scientist did expose himself to tapeworms over a number of months, and he actually gained 2 pounds. So no. Now, I don't know if that was actual tapeworm that was 2 pounds, or he just actually gained 2 pounds. I'm not sure on that. But other tapeworms can cause big problems. The pork tapeworm, for example, can cause a brain cyst because it is migrating in an incorrect manner. Multiple sclerosis, that's a human autoimmune disease where the immune system isn't acting as it should. This appears to be less severe with people with parasites. And this makes sense with the idea, that allergies are so present today because we're over-hygienic, because we don't have exposure to parasites. Therefore, our immune system isn't being properly trained. Therefore, it is acting against what it should normally be doing and attacking the pollen in the air, for example. Now, I'm not saying you should go give parasites to your children or anything like that, but this is just one theory that's out there. And even secular scientists have a hard time explaining parasites. The evolutionary worldview makes it very difficult to figure out how 2 separate organisms can be so intricately interwoven in their life cycles. But this is definitely a opening field of research for many.
Especially since the parasite, evolutionarily speaking, would be on a much different time scale than the host animal.
Yeah, it has to have a number of major changes to integrate into the host.
So I got a mosquito comment when you're ready.
Sure, go ahead with this mosquito.
So the mosquitoes feed off the proteins in the blood,
Mhm.
and it's, I don't know, it seems like a classic example of a modern day parasite, with the females feeding off human blood, where the males feed off plants 100%. And so theoretically, in a different time, in a different world where proteins are much more available, it would have, the pregnant female as well, would have fed off of the readily available proteins and not needed a host.
Yeah, male mosquitoes are one major pollinator that we have, but female mosquitoes, when they're pregnant, do bite us for the extra nutrition in our blood. And it's the saliva that makes you itch. And so these are just a number of features that we see today that are slightly less than what they should be and create a very irritating, if not deadly, problem for us. And even the diseases that mosquitoes and ticks have, for example. Lyme disease in humans is very bad. Lyme disease in dogs, very little problem. Only about 5% of dogs that are exposed to it get sick, and it's very easily treated in them. So a lot of these organisms, a lot of these bacteria that we see, these parasites that we see, if they are in the correctly designed host, their function, their negative effects are greatly reduced, if not gone. Take raccoons. There is a roundworm in raccoons that for them, at worst, causes some mild indigestion, so maybe diarrhea, if there's a lot of them in there. But for people, this is deadly because it migrates to the wrong area and can go into your brain, go into your eye, a very big problem. And so these are just a number of the things that we're seeing today. From the evolutionary point of view, it's very difficult to explain why some they work better in and some they don't, and then how they actually got integrated with one, let alone all of them, is a big question. But from a creationist point of view, it makes a very more likely sense to explain all this. Any more questions on the fall before we move on to the next period, the pre-flood, the Antediluvian period? Anything coming in? I'll wait a few moments.
I'll cut you off if they put something you need to go.
Sounds good. Let me get a drink of water. So now we're going to be talking about the period after the curse, again, anywhere from day 8 to about day 120, day 118, to the flood. And this would have been up to about year 1650, so 1,650 years after creation give or take a few years. Otherwise known as the world that then was in 2 Peter. And as far as antediluvian, just means on the other side of the flood, before the flood. The key thing that we're going to notice is that it was much different, much more diverse than our modern ecosystems, our modern world. Now, our basic understanding of taxonomy is species is, just a dog. Genus, all the canines like wolves and stuff like that. Family, this is at the level of biblical kinds for most families that we see based upon the modern taxonomy, the modern sorting system. Order, class, phylum, and so on are based upon similarities in those families. So from a biblical point of view, these would be based upon similarities in kinds, not because they came from the same thing, but because they share some features, like being four-limbed, having fur, laying eggs, stuff like that. Just because humans are trying to sort the world we live in. Now, if you look there on that list, we see a large number of extinct orders, but also extinct classes. Mammals are a class level sorting. That's a lot. There's a lot of mammals. And you can see there 57 different classes. Now these aren't all animals. There are plants and other things in here. But 52 classes, 52 methods of sorting these. These are large, these are a lot of kinds in here that are extinct. Now we don't know if these died out before the flood or if they died out after the flood. So there are some questions with this, but it's no doubt that the world before the flood was vastly different from our own. And even those creatures that exist on both sides of the flood may have been so different that we don't recognize them. There is a lot of diversity in God's created kind. Now these ecosystems that you see in the museums are probably pretty close to what some ecosystems existed before the flood. Now these are not different time periods, but different locations. Now, they probably didn't look just like this because during the flood, there is a mixture of fossils from different locations based upon the water currents and such. So this is assuming that these organisms all existed at the same place. We can't assume that for all of them, so it does take some understanding. For example, in all fossil beds, we find water organisms, clams and stuff like that. It is very unlikely that those existed at all these ecosystems. It is more likely that they got mixed in because you're taking all this water and mixing it in when the flood is coming up on land. So there is some uncertainty with this as far as what it exactly looked like, but this can at least be somewhat close. And from this, we can understand that it was warmer. There was likely no ice. The tropical zones were likely much wider, meaning that instead of it being tropical in Florida alone, it may have been tropical here in Indiana, potentially. And even the poles wouldn't be extremely cold, but would have been more temperate today. And again, humans weren't eating meat, at least not underneath the command of God, and they were living over 900 years. And all this is likely due to genetic changes, genetic expression changes. We just don't know the exact changes that would have occurred. And we know, based upon the sheer abundance of coal and fossil fuels, that there was a lot of plants, far more than what exists today. And this has brought up the idea of something called a floating forest. In a lot of these coal pockets, we find evidence of hollow trees and hollow roots. Hollow roots do not work well in soil. But today we do have some plants in marshes. They're nowhere near as big as trees, but they function very similar to what we're seeing in this fossil record here. So it's possible that there could have been large expanses of floating forests. Now, during the flood as well, there is a potential that there was massive algae blooms, because the water would have been very warm because of all the volcanic activity, and you have a lot of this dead material in the water giving a lot of nutrients. So during the flood, there is massive algae blooms that would also explain the large production of coal and other fossil fuels that we find today. And during this time, we're going to see a massive increase in violence and evil. Carnivory, disease, all flesh being filled with violence. In the fossil record, the record that is produced by the flood, we see multiple examples of this. Tumors, broken bones, embedded teeth of predators, even in other predators. All this is found in the fossil record. All this death, all this violence. And so we're seeing this, that all animals express some of these features that we're seeing at this time. And for humans, it may have been harder to raise food. We know that Cain, when he murdered his brother, was punished and cursed, on top of Adam's curse to the ground. And God promised not to again curse the ground anymore for man's sake in Genesis 8. Yet we know that this was an Adam's curse because we still have to work for the ground today to produce our food. And while this could refer to the flood really isn't referred to as a curse of the ground or anything like that I can find. And in the same section, though it's a different chapter, but in the same talk there, capital punishment is then introduced. So when God is talking about not again cursing the ground, capital punishment is being introduced. So it is likely that before the flood, there was some sort of punishment that when you killed somebody, the ground was no longer producing food. And it makes sense where Cain was promised to be avenged sevenfold. So it seems that there is some sort of law there that God is saying that since you killed somebody, if somebody kills you, I'm going to add on to that sevenfold. And so it also makes sense with the line of Cain. The line of Cain, we see a number of their productions, a number of their jobs. Herder, musician, miner, stuff like that. And so we see that they're not farmers from what we can tell. And that would make sense if they were very violent, which we do see that his genealogy did produce a murderer at the very least. Now this is just one potential. We don't know this for sure, but it definitely is a potential from what we have in Scripture. And next we're going to be talking about everybody's favorite animal, dinosaurs. Unfortunately, this is being used by the evolutionary community to draw in a lot of people, especially children. In schools, it's estimated that about 90% of Christian households, Christian children, attend state public schools. And in them, they're being heavily indoctrinated with the evolutionary worldview. And in the media especially, dinosaurs are the main tool for that. But what is a dinosaur? Now, a dinosaur is not a kind, but just a grouping of animals based upon some physical similarities. Now that is being changed with the modern taxonomy, the modern sorting, because evolutionists have then put birds in with dinosaurs. Not because they share any physical characteristics, but only because it was required for their worldview. On the bottom left, you can see some sorting based upon certain physical characteristics. Those black lines are not transition fossils, but just a way of sorting them based upon design features. On the right, you will see the actual fossils in yellow and the supposed transitions that they have no evidence for in the gray. So that is the actual data we have as far as in the rock layers. The Cretaceous period isn't a period, it's a rock layer from a biblical worldview. And so we see these animals existing in these sediments, but we see no sign of the supposed transitions from an evolutionary worldview that is required from an evolutionary worldview. From a biblical worldview, we're looking at these animals based upon kinds, or some have tried to refer to this as baraminology. And this is basically a way of looking at animals. We are looking both for a continuous relationship and a discontinuous relationship. So on the bottom, you'll see a evolutionary tree in deep time, and on the right of that view, on the right of that picture, you'll see the biblical creationist orchard. So we are looking for some similarities, the same way as all the breeds of dog came from the same kind of animal. We're looking for some similarities in the natural world. We'll get into this at a later date when we talk about speciation after the flood. But an evolutionist is not looking for discontinuity. They're not looking for any breaks in this relationship. Therefore, they are very unlikely to find it. In the scientific community, this is called confirmation bias. So if you are going out to find something, you are very likely to find it, even if it's not there. Many scientific papers are later found out to be false because of this bias. And unfortunately, it is very heavy in the evolutionary community. But back to what is a dinosaur. These are some of the features. You don't have to know them, but just for your information, just so you can have, okay, that's what a dinosaur is. That's why they're separated or sorted this way. These are the features why we sort dinosaurs as dinosaurs. It's just because they share some similar design features. The same way mammals share producing milk, 4 limbs, stuff like that, or the potential for 4 limbs, since whales and such are mammals as well. Now, as far as types of dinosaurs, they're separated by 2 basic features, into 2 big groups, I should say. The bird-hipped, which ironically are not the ones that are thought to have evolved into birds from the evolutionary worldview, and the lizard-hip. So the bird-hip are things like Stegosaurus, Triceratops, while the lizard-hips are like Patasaurus and Diplodocus. And there are noted about 300 dinosaur species. But that number is both increasing and decreasing. Increasing because we're finding new fossils, but decreasing because what we think of as one species is actually another, and we're actually merging species, which makes perfect sense from a biblical worldview, but is very questionable from an evolutionary worldview. So there is a lot of pushback against this, but it's also being pushed for by the evolutionary community, so there is kind of like a civil war going on. Take the left picture there. The top left picture, that is a dinosaur called Dracorex hogwartsius. That is its real name. Yet, it is now thought that that is just a young version of the previously known dinosaur, the Pachycephalosaurus, there at the bottom center of that picture on the left. And from a creationist point of view, Ceratopsia would be a biblical kind. And even in the evolutionary community, they are saying that some of these Ceratopsia are actually the same species, not separate species, meaning that they are the same animal in different stages of its life. So overall, from a biblical worldview, from a creationist perspective, there are about 50 kinds of dinosaurs. So we'd expect 50 different animals, that would be classified as dinosaurs on the ark, and plus their pair. Now, as I said before, there is virtually no evidence of any supposed transition species, and definitely no transitions of design features. You can see here on the top right, that's a head of a Triceratops. Just below that is its first vertebra. That is the portion of the backbone that is holding that head. Very well special designed to hold such a massively heavy object. While you can see the vertebra for the long neck there at the bottom is just as well special designed, but not anywhere in the same features. So very well special designed, very intricately designed, but in a completely different way. So all these dinosaurs are extremely specialized, extremely different, with extremely different functions, with no transitions between them as far as a lot of these functions that we're seeing. They just pop into the fossil record. So what happened? We have no evidence of any transition species before dinosaurs. We have no evidence after or in between. So through the last 100 years, there's been a number of different theories. If you watch the movie Fantasia, you will see the dinosaurs dying in the desert because the lead theory at the time was climate change. Then it changed to an asteroid impact. The Chicxulub, the Yucatan Peninsula asteroid was the primary one. But you can see there on the top, all those little dots in the US are dinosaur beds, fossil beds. Yet the impact would not have really affected or created those sediments or killed those dinosaurs. So that has led to the idea that they evolved into birds. Yet there are a number of problems with this, the key one being little evidence for this, and the few that they have don't fit very well. We do find feathers prior to dinosaurs, you can see there a picture. Yet many evolutionists will say these aren't really feathers. Now, birds would have had to exist with and before dinosaurs in the fossil record, so they have to integrate that somehow into dinosaurs turning into birds. We also have a lot of fake fossils. In China, as many as 80% of the marine reptile fossils on display have been altered or manipulated. And as such example as Lucy, you can see how they are altering fossils to fit their view, their confirmation bias. So there are a lot of things that are suspect as far as their descriptions, and so this is a very intricate field that you have to get into the nitty-gritty to find what the problem is. Thankfully, there are many paleontologists that can do this, and you can find many articles that go into some of these supposed finds. And we're going to be going into some of these finds next time, especially focusing on dinosaurs and feathers. So if you have any questions on this, as far as what we covered today, give us a text, give us an email. I'd be more than happy to discuss a lot of this stuff. But next time, we're going to be talking about dinosaurs, feathers, and did they have them, and if so, which ones? Thank you.